Okay guys, so today I wanted to make a short video on the YGO Omega stats. These are on the most used decks and the highest win rate decks and the most used cards and the highest win rate cards. So one of the most important things about playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And building your deck is that you have to think about the meta that you're participating in. If you go to a major event versus a smaller event or your locals or whatever dueling sim you're using, the meta that you're going to be up against, generally speaking, is not going to be the same. And when it comes to not just the side deck, but also the main deck, you have to build differently based on the meta you're going to be facing. Now, this data obviously is specific to YGO Omega, but I still think it's interesting because usually people will look at a YouTuber saying, here's the most broken deck. And a lot of people think, well, if I'm not playing this deck, I'm just going to lose. But that's not necessarily represented in the meta that you're going to be playing in. If you're going to like a WCQ or something, yes, you probably should be playing Fiendsmith Snake Eyes right now before the ban list. But if you're going to be playing on dueling sims, those decks aren't actually even as popular as you would think they are. So let me give a quick review of this. Now, before I get into it, I just want to say that the major limitation of this data is they do not show deck win rate or representation or card win rate or representation broken down by MMR bracket. And that's very unfortunate because what we're seeing here is aggregate data. So if we look at, for example, top 16 decks, I'll get into this more specifically, but just to show you an overview, this is aggregate information across all brackets, presumably. But undoubtedly, there would be differences in, wait, where was this again? There would be differences in deck win rate and representation based on the bracket that you're in, because a deck might be hard to play, or there may be a huge skew in the decks represented in certain brackets and it may change matchups or whatever. I can't really speak for these categories. My own experience is in Master and Omega tier. So the distribution here shows you that Omega is the top sub 3%, and then Master is plus 4. So 4, 5, 6, 7, top 7% is Master and above. I'm only in the lower tiers when I have to place. So if you're in these tiers, then let me know if you've observed something different in the meta. I'd be interested to see if people aren't playing the same decks. So let's begin by talking about deck representation and win rate, and then card representation and win rate. So the most used decks are Tenpai and Voiceless Voice, first of all. And I have to say that at Master and Omega level, this is absolutely 100% my experience. Tenpai players, these absolute animals, every single time I try to play Runic White Forest, they're dropping Mulcharmy Purulia or Dimension Shifter, and it is absolutely horrendous. This deck, I would say, even though you have good toolbox options in the Runic cards, just them opening D-Shifter especially, but also Purulia, makes this matchup a lot harder. If you guys have played Runic in general or Runic White Forest, or sorry, White Forest in general or Runic White Forest, and you have any tips on how to play against Shifter or Purulia or side against it, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. But that matchup is super polarizing based on whether or not they've drawn those cards, in my experience. Voiceless Voice, for me, is probably the deck that I have the least knowledge on, despite facing against it quite often. I'm just kind of hoping that people will stop playing it because I don't want to read the cards, which is obviously not a good mentality to have if you're trying to climb ladder. But these are the most represented decks here. Now, what you may notice if you've looked at YGO stats before, or like DB stats or whatever, is that the groupings aren't perfect. So for example, we see what is called Diabellstar, Sinful Spoils, Snake Eye, but then there's also like Diabellstar, Fiendsmith, Snake Eye, and sometimes you don't know exactly what categories should be combined versus not. But still, the Fiendsmith or the Snake Eyes representation overall is a lot lower than what we've seen both when you enter major events like the WCQs, where they start around 25% representation, and then in a top cut where you get closer to 50%. So that's worth noting. I think the Tenpai is probably a good choice both for lower MMR players and higher MMR players, because there's some helmetness to it in the sense that you can main deck D-Shifter and Purulia and just go second, or you can just play breakers. But then there are also more specific niche things that you can do with a deck that still rewards some level of skill. So yeah. But then if we just go down the list here, we see that there are still people playing Labyrinth, even Kashtira, Branded Despia. I don't see Kashtira or Branded or Labyrinth at all in Master or Omega. Fluanderies, I've never seen that. I do see Runic White Forest sometimes. Yubel is way more popular, at least in my bracket, than it is here. I've never seen Melodious. Chimera, I've seen like once. I've never seen Pearly Hero. These are like the much smaller represented decks. If we move over to top 16 decks by win rate, I think this is a little bit more interesting. But again, remember, this is aggregate data, so this is not broken down by bracket. The Diabellstar Fiendsmith Snake Eye, as they're calling it, has the highest win rate, and that is what you would expect if a deck is the best deck. But we have the second highest win rate coming in Ritual Beast. And for people that may be surprised by this, you should remember that in Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially if cards have a lot of text or do weird things that aren't super standard and people don't know what those cards do, especially if there are a lot of new players in the game now when Ritual Beast is kind of an older deck that got new support, people don't know what these cards do. And it also can play cards like Shifter and Protoss and benefit from things that most decks don't benefit from. So this will have a different matchup spread, and people are just going to lose because they don't know what this deck does. So this is also not like surprising per se, even though it's obviously not comparable to Snake Eyes in terms of the actual strength of the deck. Then we have Kashtira, which I guess that's maybe surprising to me. I don't know if this is something that has like a win rate that's super jacked up because of the lower brackets, because this deck is easier to play. And maybe players who don't understand how triggers work are more susceptible to cards like Unicorn and Fenrir. But that would be surprising to me. I don't know if Fiend just means Fiendsmith or how they're counting this, because there is an actual Fiendsmith deck with the White Dust on, I think it's called, and some Cybers cards. I don't know if that's what this is referring to or if this is just data of decks that are playing Fiendsmith cards. We see Fiendsmith Yubel has a really high win rate. That's what we would expect. Voiceless Voice has a high win rate. People have been talking about this deck falling off, and I feel like maybe it's true that, you know, Snake Eyes is better and Yubel is better, but when I play against this deck, I do think that the soft locks it has, like stopping you from targeting their cards, at least if you're playing Runic especially, like you have to draw specific combinations of cards to be able to deal with this. So I feel like this deck is still a strong deck, and if you don't stop it early, once they get rolling, this can be very, very strong. Also, most decks lost cards like Baron before, but they still have Skull Guardian with its negate and all that type of stuff. So, and then ways to recur cards from banishment and all that stuff with Blessing. So in my personal experience, although I have to say that I am biased because this is probably the deck that I know the least about, this seems good to me, so I'm not surprised by this. And then Tenpai, 55% win rate. I mean, in the OCG, Tenpai is one of the few decks that has consistently performed super well, regardless of what the best decks were. So I feel like that makes sense. Exodia Millennium, this has to be one of those things that the win rate is overrepresented because there are a much smaller number of players playing this. And if you're playing this, you're probably like a huge fan of the archetype, and so you know how it works, and your opponents don't. Yeah, and then just breezing through the last of these groups, we have Flu, Sprite, Runic. I'm curious how much of this is Runic Stun versus like White Forest. Puppet, every single person in here, I despise you entirely, and I wish that you never played Yu-Gi-Oh! Again. Branded Despia, I never see this. Toy White Forest, shout out to you guys. Labyrinth and Runic White Forest. I think that this deck, the Runic version, it has a very different matchup spread. I made a video on this recently, and so it's in kind of a weird position where you have to play the deck perfectly because the Runic cards are not high impact cards, but they are toolbox. So you can out a lot of things that normally you wouldn't be able to out, but if you use them incorrectly or you play unsafely and then you get ashed on like a greedy fountain for 3 and you have no recovery, you could just lose. So I feel like decks like Sprite, for example, or Runic Stun are a lot more forgiving, and it makes sense that they would have higher win rates in aggregate data. But I feel like at the higher level of gameplay, this would probably have like a higher MMR gameplay. This would have a higher win rate than some other variants of the deck. So that's my opinion on that. Now, if we look at some of the most used cards, we have, I guess, things that wouldn't surprise anyone. Ash Blossom, Imperm, actually Harpy's Feather Duster. This has to be up here because of Tenpai. All the Tenpai players that I play against are maining like all breakers and then Shifter and Perulia. And it's crazy. And they draw Feather Duster against me every single game, by the way. Little Knights, Call by the Grave. Actually, kind of surprised that this is so high up because I don't know how many people main this. I guess a lot. Cosmic, solid, safe side deck card. Nibiru, Tactics, Droll, Lightning Storm, Evenly, Veiler, Debarrier. So I guess like a lot of the basic stuff that people think is good already. If we go to the top cards now, what's interesting about this is that one of the most used cards, the most used card in the entire game, has a very high win rate. Well, it's 600k versus 579. So I guess it's like, it's not a drastic difference, but that's still something for being the most used card. And I wonder if they're saying, if they're counting this based on just it was in your deck and you played a game, or if you drew it, and you used it. Because I don't think there's any like tooltip that explains this distribution, and I feel like it could be any of those three. But it's still useful to see that Ash Blossom is a good card in aggregate. Imperm as well. Feather Duster, which is crazy, and this has to be mostly because of Tenpai players, I feel like. Call by the Grave, Cosmic Cyclone, okay, Nib, Talent, Droll is here. I guess it doesn't have as high of a use rate. And 356 to 343, I mean, that's still something. Lightning Storm, evenly matched, Veiler. I guess most of these cards are, like, I was looking to see if there was a theme, a difference in theme between, like, low impact and high impact, but it's a good mix of a bunch of different cards. And also, like, cards that are going second only, like the Feather Duster or evenly matched or Lightning Storm. But then they also have, like, traps like Debarrier. Prosperity, interestingly, is here. 263 versus 237. So, yeah, I wish that this was broken down by the MMR bracket, and I know this would be way too much to ask, but it would be so cool to see if they could break this down based on the deck that was being played, so that you could say, like, you know, in this MMR bracket, is it better if you play hand traps and Tenpai versus just like Shifter, Perulia, and then all breakers? You know, like that would be much more insightful than just looking at this stuff in aggregate. Anyhow, I think that is basically all for today. If you have any things that you think that I might have missed or explanations for things that you've seen, let me know in the comments below. There is a Discord where people talk about deck building and strategy and stuff like that. So I'll put the link. You can join if you want. And I'll put the link to this also in the description. Anyhow, thanks for watching.